The creators of the Memex are aware that it's not a single tool, but it's supposed to be an ecosystem of tools that are mutually supportive in the overall goal of providing orientational knowledge. These tools must tackle at least a few dozen of questions and problems at once to live up to this expectation, and they also have to achieve their goal structurally and not narratively. This is, the Memex tools are not supposed to tell you what to believe or not believe, but they're supposed to provide you with a structure of exchange and a structure which provides you with the minimal amount of perspectives that you can take on a certain issue if you really want to be truly informed on it. Now, in the following, I'll try to cover these few dozen of questions that these Memex tools have to tackle, and I think every single one of these questions is a tough problem, and we have to think about it, how to solve it. And unless we spend some time on this, I think creating such Memex tools will become very, very difficult. The first problem our Memex tools have to tackle with is hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art of understanding. It works out the basic principles that we have to follow if we truly want to understand each other. Because, as it turns out, when we're talking about complex issues, we use highly subjective terms. We think we're saying the same thing, but we're actually not. We have highly subjective associations with complex terms, so that we almost have a private language and are talking past each other instead of talking to each other. Now, the idea in hermeneutics is not to get rid of subjectivity and talk only objectively. This seems to be impossible anyway, but the suggestion is to make subjectivity as explicit as possible. And traditional way of doing this is by creating a narrative, by talking about your perspective, about how you get to your perspective. Now, the Memex does actually tackle this problem of making subjectivity explicit, but in a very different way. It's not about creating your own narrative about yourself, but by making visible your annotations and your highlights, you're making visible what is important to you, and you're making visible how you get to your perspectives. In other words, imagine the people who actually wrote articles also linked to their Memex account, so that you could see what they had read before writing a certain article. You could see what they took as important. You could see which passages they skipped. You could see which passages they couldn't understand. The Memex itself would make visible their subjectivity, so that you would have a better foundation to have an informed view on how they mean what they mean. Another problem that we have to deal with when it comes to these Memex technologies and tools is the problem of transparency. Transparency as such has no orientational value. If we made everything transparent, we wouldn't end up knowing what to pay attention to and what not. What we need instead is transparency of depth. Depth is your ability to witness different perspectives and to make them cohere with each other, and to be capable to focus on that which the moment demands, that which is necessary to know in the very moment of action. The traditional way of getting depth across is grand narrative. In other words, people have to write a dozen or so books where they sketch the basic perspectives that they're capable of covering, and where they make these perspectives cohere with each other. Some of these books have tried to create so-called integral theories. This is how you get your depth across. Now, the Memex actually implicitly deals with this issue, because what it does is it makes visible your grand narrative, your bigger picture of all the perspectives that you're capable of taking, or at least those that you have documented using the Memex, and it shows which you have left out and how you would try to actually bring them together. It helps you express your subjectivity without you necessarily having to talk about it or write a book about it. Another challenge that our Memex tools have to face is the problem of where to start. The sequence in which we encounter problems and ideas is crucially important for our own development. This has been widely recognized, and this is one of the reasons why we have curricula in most learning institutions. Without such curricula, some of the ideas that we want to get across might never be understood. It's crucially important in which sequence you take in ideas, and the way in which the Memex can help us with this is by making visible the genesis of individual perspectives, by making visible how people mastered a certain field as individuals and even as collectives, as to suggest you which steps are most likely to be rewarding for yourself. Individual knowledge always comes with a context. The old hermeneutic dictum that in order to understand the part, you have to understand the whole, and in order to understand the whole, in this case the entire book, you have to understand the parts, which is the individual sentences or chapters, is actually applicable in this sense as well. Whenever you come up with individual pieces of knowledge, they always stand within an entire discourse, or what have been called frames. Now, this is why we have curricula. They're not only there to make you encounter the right ideas in the right sequence, but they have to also make sure that you encounter the ideas systematically. This is that you cover the entire discourse and know the context of the ideas that you're learning. The Memex is helping us with this because instead of institutionalizing this wisdom, what the Memex does is it makes visible these connections between individual ideas and how they hang together and which different ideas you have to cover if you actually want to get the big picture, if you want to actually understand the entire discourse. It makes visible opinion leaders, it makes visible the major topics that have to be covered by you if you want to be capable of following the entire discourse. Now we come to another issue where the universities have not been particularly successful, which is bridging different social spheres. There is a huge divide between the specialized academic world and the life world. Academics usually have no interest in sharing their specialized perspectives through social media. For one, they don't think this medium is adequate to get their views across. It doesn't allow for the level of differentiation that would be necessary. You simply can't tell some things by using 3 or 4 sentences. It's just not possible. For another thing, I think they're not big fans of the idea that everyone can contribute on any topic. I think you need some kind of preparation to say something meaningful on an issue. Science is not a democratic process in the end. The result of all of this is that there's this huge divide between academia and the life world, and even where academia itself could profit from a feedback from the life world. This is especially the disciplines like sociology, psychology, all the humanities that are in some way connected to consciousness. All of these could highly profit from a feedback from the life world. They also are disconnected from the life world and end up in theories that actually have nothing to do with human consciousness anymore. So I think what we have to aim at with these Memex technologies is to create communication channels between these different spheres so that everyone can contribute with what they have to contribute. Even if it's just to point out that one passage in a book that you're reading right now is connected to a different passage in an entirely different book. You don't have to be a professor to do that, but still pointing out that connection is something that's valuable and that will help someone else who would actually have to otherwise spend the time on researching this connection. Hierarchies are crucially important for our survival as individuals and as collectives. Even within us as individuals, our perception is structured hierarchically. There is something which is in the focus of your attention, standing against the background of all the other things that you don't pay attention to and you don't feel responsible for. In a very similar way when it comes to social hierarchies, we are delegating certain decisions to others and letting them decide in certain contexts. Instead of taking up the responsibility for ourselves. Now, one of the major goals of propaganda is to make us distrust social hierarchies. This is, we're taking up more responsibility in individual cases than we're actually capable of carrying. We are asking questions that we're not capable of answering ourselves as individuals. We are in this way we're becoming separated from the community and incapable to act in synchrony with the community. The worst form of this form of aversion against hierarchy is to doubt your own identity or personhood, where you become incapable of focusing your attention on anything that matters to you. This is maybe the ultimate form of propaganda, when you as an individual become so fragmented that you become incapable not only of socializing with others and having shared experiences and shared goals, but you become incapable of maintaining personal identity across individual moments of time. You become a vessel in a mere stream of individual experiences. Now, there have been many reasons why we distrust competence hierarchies, even though institutions, of course, have tried to work out different mechanisms to make sure that our competence hierarchies that we build are somewhat reliable and somewhat connected to reality. In other words, those who are in charge in certain situations really are in touch with reality when they're making the decisions. Now, the Memex, I think, adds a few additional layers of feedback so that we can have a more informed opinion whether someone in a certain context truly deserves to be what has been called a natural authority, I think was the word, someone that you intuitively feel has more wisdom in a certain situation to make a decision. What namely the Memex does is it doesn't simply list all your credentials, all your publications, but it actually shows on a very, very detailed scale how far you have really covered the details, which passages you have really paid attention to, which passages you have skipped. It's very easy to have a long publication list, and it's also very easy to create a huge bibliography that you then add to your book, but it's an entirely different game if you can show in detail that you really have covered all these materials in detail. And I think this would be an additional factor that we could take in to have a more educated opinion or more informed opinion on who is actually trustworthy when it comes to certain questions than who is not. Another topic that we have to cover when it comes to Bildung is framing. It has been suggested that whenever you think a single thought, whenever you make a single experience, this is only possible against a so-called background of experience or a so-called frame. These consist of very foundational, basic distinctions that we learn to make, and unfortunately frames are unconscious. Frames are mutually exclusive, they are incommensurable, and basically set the limits of your individual perspective. So you can jump around between different frames and have different individual thoughts, but your thoughts are always restrained by the frame that you're using. It has been suggested that one of the major goals of general education or Bildung is to precisely become aware of the framing in which we are embedded and become more self-conscious, become, in other words, more free to engage in different frames and enact the frames that are necessary in a certain situation. All frames necessarily limit our capacity to think and our capacity to act in certain situations. All frames, on the other hand, also bring us in touch with reality to some degree. And what is new and the challenge that we are facing right now is whenever we're taking up an individual perspective to try and shift the frame. In other words, to try to make this individual view comparable with different frames and look at an issue from an entirely different frame. This is how we would collectively augment an individual perspective and make it integrated or commensurable with views coming from entirely different background assumptions. This is a huge challenge, and I don't see universities having been particularly successful at that. Nor have individual communities been able of creating such an awareness of frames and of our own bias. We need to have constantly available different levels of resolution for us to have an easy orientation of what follows next in our development. Development as such, I think, is very difficult to predict. You cannot know what will inspire people and where they will feel the need they have to go next. This is highly subjective and depends on many, many factors. But what will always be of help is if knowledge is always available in different levels of resolution. A very general level, a very low resolution general picture, which gives you a sense of what there is to be seen, what there is to be found. But we also need very high resolution, dense pictures which add quite a lot of details to our perspectives and take them apart into their most fine constitutive parts. We need both of these levels constantly available. And obviously, whenever you express a position, whenever you have some kind of understanding, you yourself are not capable of covering all these levels of resolution at once. But this is why we have the community for that. We can have the community create the abstracts that I was talking about, these low resolution big pictures, these general orientations. all the kind of materials that we have been creating forever at our universities, but never really gets published. I mean, think about it. All these valuable excerpts, assessment questions that students have created, none of that ever got published, and none of that was ever really made use of in society in general. And yet they create these different resolutions on these texts that actually help us to get at the deeper meaning of a text. Think of musicians explaining musical concepts on several different levels, for example. Take Jacob Collier's explanation of harmony on seven different levels. The point is, you can't skip the first 6 levels if you want to grasp the 7th level. All of them are necessary. All of them use their own metaphors, their own simplifications. All of them are in some way wrong and partly true, but all of them are still necessary. And what we as a community can actually do is augment texts by adding these different levels to each and every single one of them, and also adding the details that are necessary to show whether something is valid or not. The traditional way of dealing with noise has been the top-down approach, where you inhibit information flow from the bottom up and impose views on individuals. We have seen that these approaches are highly limited and in many cases lead to collapse. Now, the opposite approach, where you put together a bunch of people who have the ability to democratically engage in discourse and come to something like a shared meaning, shared truths, I have seen actually work, but only within very small scales, because it really depends on the right people meeting each other at the right time and discussing the right issues. If one of these factors is off, such a thing as emergent meaning usually doesn't really happen. So in other words, this approach doesn't really scale. It's something that works within very small communities. I would suggest something new. I would really want to retain the idea that anything goes, that you can have any kind of opinion you want, and that you're perfectly free to discuss anything you want. But I would ask you to do so in an orderly fashion. Think of the Memex. What the Memex does, it allows for basically any kind of opinion. But what it does is, it orders these opinions and gives you a picture, an overview of what their counter positions are immediately. So whenever you express a view, you are actually bowing to the ability for others to see where your view is coming from. You make transparent the genesis of your perspective. This is again the very opposite of propaganda. Propaganda doesn't make transparent the origin of a perspective. Propaganda is out of nothing. You don't know where propaganda comes from. Another point is, you also make transparent the limits of your perspective. You show what your perspective is capable to deal with and where it ends, where someone else has to take up the path of meaning making. As long as we follow these principles, as long as we're willing to order our acts of communication and our acts of expressing our views, I don't think we can have any kind of view that is so problematic that it could bring down an entire society. It would lead to some kind of anonymous cooperation, not in the sense that individuals are consciously cooperating with each other. And this has been the assumption so far in the past. We have to get people to cooperate with each other, right? I don't think this works at large scale. What at large scale we must achieve is the coordination between individual acts of individuals who don't know each other, but coordinate these acts of meaning making, these acts of expression, and bringing together into a bigger picture that helps individuals on their individual path of sense making to make the right next step in their personal development. Now, for me personally, the most important goal of all of this is not Bildung. It's not orientational knowledge. It's not to have the facts right, to know which step to take in your personal or professional development next, but it's to foster mutual recognition. In becoming aware of your own perspectives, in becoming aware of your own frames, you strengthen the so-called witness. It's that ability in you to see what you see, to become aware of your own bias, your own prejudice, to see yourself as another. Now, the witness looking within feels like freedom. The witness feels like you having a choice to take a different perspective and not being bound to the perspectives that you have been given. When the witness looks without into the outside world, the witness feels like compassion, because what it sees is other creatures struggling to make sense. And it relates to them. It creates unity on an entirely different level. So what I'm suggesting here is not to unify everyone by sharing the same views on everything. I don't think this will work. I think we need to maintain many different perspectives that are mutually exclusive at once. In other words, there will always be paradoxes and always be contradictions in our views. This is not the problem, but what we need is an awareness that this is a necessary feature of meaning making per se. And what we need is a connection to all the other creatures that are trying to make sense. This, I think, the Memex would foster, and I believe all the different Memex technologies must envision as maybe the highest goal to attain, is to get a depolarization not by unifying opinions and getting everyone to believe the same thing, but by strengthening the witness in each and every one of us.